Okay, so now we're going to move on to John Reznick and to Sam Hudis of, let me get it, Competitive Advantage Research.
That's right.
And Sam is a treasurer of Gizmo, and so we welcome you here especially because you're one of our own. But why don't you take it away, whatever you want to say is.
Sure. Before kind of zooming out and telling you more about myself, the really great segue between this presentation and Steve's is Steve told you a lot about using data to do kind of rear-looking analysis. Let's look at an election that's concluded, take the data, put it on a map, and see what we know or what we might infer, whether or not we go to predictive models. That's all based on kind of doing a rear-looking analysis. What we do actually is work directly with the media, with politicians, and with major institutions during their elections, during their political cycles. And while there's plenty of opportunity to look at, 2013, 2009, 2012, 2010, 2014, etc., we are doing it particularly with a mind for applied results. If you go into a political campaign headquarters, and you go into the inner room where the principal and/or the campaign manager sits, usually behind a door that can close and lock, there's a map that's often the size of this wall. It'll be 3 or 4 gigantic paper panels that shows them their district, their neighborhood. Steve told you everything I fortunately didn't plan to and don't have to about the complexity of election districts that are always changing, about the complexity of the data. And politicians are generally trying to work their way through this stuff without a geospatialist. Sam and I are among the first people to bring any of these techniques to operative politics outside of, working for the city or working within an academic institution. We're out here as a business offering this to folks that are trying to run their map, and they know surprisingly little about it. Although for me, the point of entry really has been their campaign finance data, because while election data, the last election, okay, we had a primary in the past, but the truth is checks are still being written all the time. The data are filed periodically, and it often gives you a look inside the campaign trail while it is still ongoing. And that's where I began. So to tell you a bit about me, at the beginning, when I was 18, I read a book by Neil Stephenson called Cryptonomicon, and love to recommend it to all of you. It is a book that filled my head at a very young age with the idea that physical activities, things that are really happening in the real world, produce sort of a byproduct of data, and that data can contain vectors of information about that activity, that you can analyze data to learn things about the real world in real time. An example in the book, it narrates how they doctored the HR files at a World War II era Bletchley Park intelligence facility, because if those files were stolen and people noticed that the heights of the employees were not in a normal distribution, they would have noticed that it was all women, and that would have given it a distinctly military application. So the idea that this data contains encoded vectors of information that people aren't necessarily perceiving. And so that's something that I took into pretty much every corridor of my career since then. I've worked in digital media, I've worked in software and technology, and I apply both of those to politics. I got my start in politics as a portrait artist, actually. I'm a Tisch grad, and I was making portraits of politicians, covering their fundraisers, but what I was really doing was capturing the social graph of politics. If there are a bunch of people in a $4,950 a plate meal, it's because they want to be there. And whether they paid to be there or someone invited them to be there, they hang out. And now you know that about them. And so originally, simply by amassing this library of photos, I was able to begin making actual inferences about who would endorse whom. Because I had been there, I had made photos of them arm in arm, I know they're friends. So during this period when I was really on the upswing as a photographer, I became the treasurer of the New York State Young Democrats. And what's interesting about that is that the NYSYD files Board of Elections campaign finance reports, same as political campaigns do. And that's what gave me a really close look at this data. And I began examining campaign finance data literally to understand my own business, to figure out when do I pitch 2013 candidates, what sorts of packages are they interested in, what do they go for. And something I discovered from the campaign finance data is that their expenditures really made no sense at all. There's no way to rationalize it. They don't know how they're spending their money. And so I began actually going through, for instance, the most frequent expenditure by candidate for mayor Bill de Blasio in 2013 was at a location called Bar Toto, around the corner from his house in Brooklyn. Now, he was purchasing food and or alcohol every time he went there because it's a bar and restaurant. But he described it roughly 75 different ways in the data as a meeting, team meeting, donor meeting, campaign finance meeting. And each of these descriptions is filer supplied. That is, the treasurer or officer who does compliance for the finance records of the campaign is just typing it in. Now, they're telling you what they're doing, not what they're buying. And this is a great example of data that are out of grain, because it would take, honestly, someone like me to go through this kind of data and determine just what percentage is being spent on calories, what percentage is being spent on digital media, what percentage is being spent on acquiring funds. And so in 2013, I had a blog where I was doing this, and at first I was actually doing it by hand. You go to the BOE website, and you can download essentially one document per candidate, per filing, per transaction type, which is to say the 2013 race had about 250 candidates all told across about 56 different offices that were up for grabs, maybe 60, and each of them filed about 7 times during the course of the election, and each of them had upwards of 10 or a dozen different transactions. So that's 250 times 7 times 10. Whatever that is, it's that many spreadsheets that you have to begin downloading and working with. So ultimately, I saw that all of this was just insane. And I literally started an angry blog about it where I put up spiteful pie charts about how politicians were actually spending their campaign money, which in a New York City context, it's commingled with public funds. We give them public funds, and they do not know how they are operationalizing it, because they're not examining this data, they're not comparing themselves to their opponents. You know, I could tell you, Bill de Blasio's cost of raising money was 5% more, that's 5 cents on the dollar more, than Christine Quinn's, and I was the only one who knew that summer, because I had gone through all of these records. But the problem with these records is that they keep on coming, kind of like hair. You're never gonna stop having to cut it, unless you go bald, I guess. But with these records, it's just not a human scale problem, so I built a database, learned how to administer SQL, and built a pipeline in order to load all of this data into a database. And again, we're talking about tens of millions of discrete individuals, dozens of millions of transactions, donations, expenditures of every kind. And then, of course, we needed the capability to review all of this information, to compare it in grain, as it were. So we built a pipeline that's essentially a web server and a Linux server that takes us from raw public data into our own data model so that we can then query the database and publish results directly to the web. So the reason for doing this is now we can conduct data mining, we can withdraw insights from the political process that no one without a database is actually doing right now. And so this allows me and our company to work with the media, we work with political campaigns, and we work with major political institutions. And so the first kind of case study I want to present of what this means, and again, I am not a geospatial guy, but I'm going to show you how this pushes towards that work and how the sort of work that geospatialists do is sorely needed in politics. So Leonard Lippmann, you might have heard of this gentleman if you followed the federal case against Sheldon Silver, who took grim space in prison. And so Leonard Lippmann is known to be the owner and manager of Glenwood Management, which is a real estate company that owns roughly 20 large-scale towers, residential towers, that they operate for tenants in New York City. Leonard is known as New York's biggest donor, and the asterisk excludes people who ran for office themselves, such as Bloomberg, Tom Golisano, etc. When you exclude people who have financed their own campaigns, this individual is the biggest checkbook in the state of New York in the 21st century. From 2012 until 2014, his donations essentially stopped completely once Shelley Silver got indicted. And so the thing with Leonard Lippmann is he's not really hiding any of this, but because of the way that the data are created and disseminated, he kind of is. And it works like this. As I said before, all campaign finance data is filer supplied, which means the filer types it in, the city or the state, whichever regulator you use, both of them are committed to presenting that data to you as is. They are not correcting, they are not treating, they are not addressing the data itself. And the thing that Leonard does is he has his office, Glenwood Management, is at 1200 Union Turnpike, New Hyde Park, New York. That address alone is indicated 96 different ways in 1,801 records that I've associated with that man at that address. Which is to say, I wrote a little query that was like, let me find everything that might be kind of like a 1200 Union Turnpike, using like wildcards and other little SQL tricks. I identified almost 100 locations that are responsive to Leonard Lippmann. Now all of them refer to this, it's one building. He's the sole occupant of the building with his businesses. And it gets more complex than that because Leonard Lippmann is not the name of the counterparty presenting most of this money, and this is where the parenthetical about the LLC loophole comes in. Traditional in real estate is to form an LLC for any individual property that you have. And each of those LLCs, in turn, are exempted from traditional New York campaign finance limits. And it was the New York rules that in turn led to the McCutcheon decision that got rid of aggregate limits at the federal level. So there's this building, whatever, slides, visual. I was able to identify essentially Glenwood Management as the sole occupant of that building. It's a real place. He's associated with it. Meanwhile, Leonard's businesses, each of his real estate LLCs, they're the ones writing checks to political campaigns. And those businesses are indicated 308 different ways in the data. And he's actually given money to 335 different political committees in the state of New York. And so that's 1,376 relationships if you're just looking at untreated, kind of raw data. And it's just over $13 million. And I can tell you that once I tracked Leonard down to his home, found his spouse, found his employees and their spouses, another $1 million shook out of this. But I'm only showing you 1,200 Union Turnpike contributions, schedules, and schedules refers to transaction types in campaign finance records. So the schedules A, B, C, D, and P are different kinds of contributions that indicate what sort of entity is giving. For instance, when Leonard's name is on the check, it's a Schedule A because he's an individual donor, such as Steve's research has displayed to you. However, B and C refer to institutions and corporate type donorships, D is an in-kind donorship, and P is when you make a contribution to a party housekeeping committee. So again, because these are 1,376 relationships, what that basically means is that Leonard's impact on New York City politics is spread over thousands of documents. You don't know what his name is, you don't know what his address is necessarily because the address is indicated so many different ways. But that's where using a database allowed me to turn this, because what you're seeing basically is a chart of you've got your 308 ways Leonard and his businesses are referred to, and you've got the 335, pardon me, committees that he's contributed to. And so this is where we start. But I'm able to do that. And that's what the database tells us. That's how we're actually using the location. We're confirming these are all his businesses. And now we understand something that we didn't previously about the person who displaced the most money of any individual this century. And of course, he then became a major cooperating witness, or literally his bagman Charles Durego did, but his business became a major witness in a serious federal case. And it was actually some of my publications about this that, honestly, corruption is good for business because the way this data are set up, it requires data mining techniques to even understand what's going in it. Not because anyone's being nefarious, but because when his West 72nd Street Garage Corp writes a check for $5,000 to Bill de Blasio or to Andrew Cuomo, they don't even necessarily know it's Leonard Lippmann. This isn't a guy who goes to parties and ends up in my photographs. This is someone who mails you a check, and then he has someone call you about the 421A tax exemption, and that's why Silver's in prison. And so the second one, we sent another guy to prison last year, and so this is another failed shakedown, and I joke about Anthony Bonomo being Andrew Cuomo's horse lord because Game of Thrones, and because for a month, Anthony Bonomo was actually the president or chair, or whatever the titular head is, of the New York State Racing Association. And so what happened with Dean Skelos, who last year was the president of the Senate on behalf of the Republicans, was he was alleged to have shaken down an individual. Now this was not, this was regarding a particular piece of legislation that would have affected the reciprocal insurance industry in a major way. Basically, there was a piece of legislation that was going to completely change an industry. The chart you're looking at is, I essentially tracked down, I'll tell you backwards. This is Anthony Bonomo and his finance network, his relatives, his businesses, political contributions per annum. It's hard to read. You start in 2000, you get to 2015. You can see this real peak in 2012 and 2013, and that's what we're going to be looking at. I actually used public data to identify this guy as the cooperating federal witness in the Skelos trial based on details from the indictment. And so you might have seen me on New York One about that. And so the indictment said the cooperating witness was in the reciprocal insurance industry and attended a fundraising event with Senator Dean Skelos and his son Adam Skelos in August of 2012. And so this is where we're going to talk about something called the house party query, because this is what I used for my own script library to figure out who this man was. So the house party query was something that I wrote during the basic form of it during 2013. You can spot house parties. You can spot where a candidate physically was on a given day by looking for essentially chunking in the data. If you see something like 40 $20 contributions all from the same zip code, that's a house party. Just knowing the political, kind of the way those mechanisms work, I can now look at the data and see those patterns. And so, for instance, John Liu hosted over 600 house parties during a 2-year span, where de Blasio was closer to 90. Quinn did maybe 70. Like, you could see that John Liu was Mr. House Party. I was trying to determine which of these guys were sociable and how much and where. And so that was something I looked at. And so I reversed the house party query. I wanted to figure out, can I build up any inferences of where Dean Skelos would have been in August of 2012 using these records, and then can I determine who was there with him and why they might intersect with this. And so I actually was able to track down a New York State Senate Republican Campaign Committee fundraiser chair, Dean Skelos. Oh, that's not on this slide. And I was able to identify that Anthony Bonomo's Physicians Reciprocal Insurance Company wrote a $10,000 check to him in August of 2012. And so this was trying to figure out a meaningful location between the lines. So the third little case study I want to present I call the problem of hedge fund spouses. And this is not that they have, this is the idea that determining valences from these political contributions itself is really hard. And the location bit we'll get into in just a minute. I did some work last year with a kind of an oppo shop called the Hedge Clippers that are out there protesting hedge fund politics. They're kind of defending a traditional model of education. They're getting involved in the Puerto Rico debt crisis. And so I did some research for them where we put out essentially hit pieces on the political finance of major hedge fund impresarios all over the country, particularly in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Florida, as it happens, and Illinois. But so for that, I did a lot of data curation. I was trying to find who are these individuals, who are their spouses, who households with them, who spends in coordination with them. And I would frequently use locations to do this. For each of these individuals, I would establish, they would often have a sequence of homes and or offices, and so I would try to see, if these people respond to this address, they live together. At the same time, they live together, but sometimes they would be there at different times. They may or not be connected. And with something like a spouse, it can be very difficult to determine, are these people connected in their political spending? Are they not talking about it? Sometimes the husband or the hedge fund manager will write all his checks from the office, but then there'll be one where his wife will write a check from home, and now I've got that address, and I'll find all kinds of other people, but we don't know as if they're spending or acting in coordination with each other. And kind of the proof in the pudding of that is the Ken Griffin divorce. This is, he runs, is it Citadel? Yes. His fund is called Citadel, and he had a famous divorce. If you look this guy up about 2 years ago, his wife got a private jet and like $1 million a month out of him. But what's really interesting about this is that over the course of the century, you can actually see they're donating in coordination for a while. They're attending parties. They're at the same event at the same time, giving kind of a double-barreled check. But then you can gradually see their actual political records begin to diverge. And then you even begin to notice she's living somewhere else. And so it's like, And then they have a famous divorce. And I mean, I already knew about the divorce when I looked at their records, but even in trying to figure out when did these folks go out of coordination with each other, can I tell when she started giving to the Working Families Party, like I don't think they're talking the same way they used to when they attended the Romney fundraiser the year before. Like you can see these things, and sometimes the address is actually the key piece to establish these linkages or to break, to say this is not the same person. My own name is described about 6 ways in New York records lexically. Even to figure out who I am could be difficult, and I'm not a big player in the actual campaign finance data that we look at. So this is some of the analysis that I'm doing. Some of the analysis that I'm doing. I think this is the part of the deck where we kind of segue into where this starts to turn into maps. And so this is something actually that Sam made. I was like, hey Sam, can you put this together really quickly? During a Republican debate several months ago, Chris Christie vowed that he would keep the Clintons at least 10 miles. They would not get within 10 miles of the White House. So we decided during the debate, we would literally map Chris Christie's Hillary Clinton exclusion zone, and we put this on the internet within a few minutes. So there's a news making, there's kind of we can inject into the story. He just said something geospatial on the debate. Let's show people what that, it basically means the Clintons are excluded from much of Maryland. Just a lot of it. Like you hear remarks like that. Do you want to add something to this slide?
Yeah, and folks here will notice that this is a quick job on Carter McGee.
Yeah, this is not the formal product, but we wanted to toss something out there really quick that you can get news making. There's certainly some room to convey a lot of information geospatially that isn't. So this is, what Sam and I do. I handle a lot of data. We bring in public data. We can massage the data, and Sam is doing all of the GIS stuff. So this was for a not-for-profit that is interested in really peeling away some of the top-level details on youth incarceration or placement in youth facilities. Because some of the top-line information suggests that, as a general problem, youth incarceration is kind of on the mend. This particular organization said if you really look under the hood, you see some troubling trends, and we want to communicate those. And so this piece is up here because what was really interesting about this piece, to me, was that the project manager at the ad agency that we were, the PR agency that we worked with, as well as the end client, loved this. They loved what Sam did and how quickly we put it together. Essentially, we developed kind of a quotient for disparity where we're dividing one of these features into the other to show the states that have the greatest disparity based on this data set that were published. But the people who did not like this were the kind of press people within the PR agency we work with. The client and the project manager were like, yeah, this is exactly what we asked for. The press people had a lot of difficulty shopping this out because it involves understanding what this quotient is, like, oh my God, arithmetic. And so it's a really interesting thing that we're trying to tell, but strikes us, we're somewhat numerate, as a really clear story, but once it goes out into the world, it's very difficult to convey information like this at a level where people are necessarily going to glom onto what it is that you're saying. And so, it was successful for us, but also I think this PR firm would have gotten more traction from this if everybody just knew maps better, was more comfortable around the sort of required numeracy of this. So one of the other things we built is a way to sequence data. And again, you're just seeing different layers, data, layer, base map, composited. When we sequence these, we are making actual videos. I'm not going to show you a video, but this is one slide in many of refugee admissions to the United States. And so we actually are going month by month, and this is just one 3-layer composite from a sequence that we produced that ran for about a minute. One of the most interesting things about this is that what you can see are natural disasters and United States wars. And so this is something we have been doing that now kind of will tie the knot back together. While we're not anywhere close to predictive models for politics based on polling or anything else, this is sort of, we're teasing out, we want to get a sense of what can we begin to understand or predict if we look at, for instance, this is financial support of presidential candidates last year through January of this year. And so we're trying to figure out, are there areas where strong financial support that early in the game tells us anything? And so we've basically just been publishing an atlas of these. We're not answering any questions yet. We're mostly building this as a tool to kind of look at, to put up tons of kind of x-rays, like analysis of these elections. And that's also where we can begin to bring in, if we want to, other geographic or geologic features. I'm fascinated by the idea of what campaign finance does as you get a certain distance from water. Like, are you on the coast? Are you on a Great Lake? Are you on a river? Otherwise, how far away are you from that? And what is your likely financial interest in politics? You know, one trend that's been discussed is the so-called recreational rural, which is understood to be a place that people of means retire to, and they have very different political views from traditional rural voters. And so that's just one, and we haven't done the work yet as far as this, but it's something that we can begin to interrogate once we have Sam put this stuff onto a map for us, and we can begin to, you know, coordinate it geospatially. So here is the one for the Republican side. And the way we publish these maps for now is that we've shown you whoever is in the race as of the day of that primary. So the original ones of these for the early states had a lot more candidates and a lot more color. And again, this is showing political engagement, individual donations in excess of $200, which means they were itemized. Below 200, they are not. And so what you're seeing, in a sense, is where this kind of support picks up. You know, for instance, when Dr. Ben Carson was still in the race, he was raising money from areas that have never been involved in political finance before. Like, it's just an interesting thing, and it bears some examination, some interrogation of what is even happening there. What does it mean that he's reaching into these geographies? Where are these geographies really being contested versus where is it in a lock? So a few more things I want to mention. The address issue and the hygiene, if you will, of the data that we do get is a serious issue. I gave testimony to the Moreland Commission to investigate public corruption, which wound down just in time to not do what the U.S. Attorney ultimately did to our legislature. But I was actually going to be collaborating with them on finding potential cases of corruption that they would then investigate. Ultimately, I gave testimony to the commission specifically about the lack of canonical identification of locations and entities within the data. That there is as much work as you saw in some of my earlier slides simply to identify what is a campaign finance network, or what are meaningful, coherent locations, and why and how do we use this information to link people. So what Sam and I are endeavoring to build at this point is essentially a series of Python scripts, a whole library, to fit with the rest of my API, which is itself a Python package, that allows us to generate maps. You know, I kind of had to inculcate Sam to the idea that I was talking about making more maps than are humanly possible, that we have to automate an exceptional number of maps. Because again, if we look at one of these, you know, this is a particular window of time, but we can also adjust that window of time to say, okay, now it's later, we can include the July filing, or let's see what was going on in 2012 with these people, or anything else that we might want to adjust about these maps. We would want to be able to do so, and we would want to be able to do so all at once. And so the thing to note about politics, kind of in closing, is that, you know, Steve showed you just the challenge of understanding this data, of understanding these geographies. And these are people who are going forward and trying to compete on these maps without any connection to actual geospatial analysis. They do polling where they very expensively contact people to get information, but they don't actually know where those people are or who those people are. Their most expensive outreach effort doesn't actually connect to voting. It connects to their kind of, I think, cack-handed attempt to understand what they should be doing with maps and with better data. That, you know, instead of polling people, you should talk to your own voters, know where they are, and that should be the style of contact and recognition that they're doing. But they aren't, even though they actually compete on maps, and they want to know everything they can about everyone else's map, because inside these maps are their conceits to victory. They're, you know, if you're running for a particular district, you're going to know, oh, the highest population density tower is here. Like, we need to have building captains here, we need canvassers here, this is where we buy a poster and hang it. And so this is a field that's ripe for the taking. And so Sam and I are very interested in how public data and public data analysis can affect outcomes, can provide clearer signal between voters, donors, public officials, and the necessary results. We also use it to fight corruption and make jokes. Are there any questions about any of that?